Well, let me say, too, thanks for helping these ladies with their project. All these experiments are pretty interesting, and they're doing some cutting-edge stuff that maybe you'll get to learn about later. I do have to say, in all my years of speaking, this is the first time people have had to sign a consent form, and the first time people have been bribed to sit through my sermon. So I appreciate you being here. Now, there is a well-known and well-told story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet in John chapter 13, a story from which we can learn very important lessons about serving. We've all heard that story before. We've seen it on flannel graph, the whole deal growing up. And it comes at a very crucial point in the ministry of Jesus. John says Jesus has been preaching and he's been healing. And in chapter 12 of the book of John, Jesus shows up in the city of Jerusalem. And in chapter 13, he sits down and enjoys a meal with his disciples. This is how John tells the story. It was just before Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that he had wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." Now, washing feet was a common practice in the day of Jesus. Needless to say, their sandals didn't quite compare to a pair of New Balance shoes, and walking across the sands of Palestine made for some pretty nasty feet. And there's a few things you just don't want to be smelling when you sit down to eat dinner at night. But Peter had an objection to Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And like Peter, a lot of us have objections to offering service to other people. People in that day, like Jesus, did not wash other people's feet. That was the work of a hired hand or a hired servant, and Jesus was neither of those. But in washing his disciples' feet, Jesus gives us important lessons. And John seems to answer some critical objections that we have when we're offered to serve. So just for a few moments, I want to take you through our objections and John's response to that. Sometimes when we're invited to serve, we respond by saying, "I don't have time to do that." Jesus didn't accept that. John chapter 13, John teaches that we should serve regardless of our schedules. John 13:1 says, "Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart this world and go to the Father." You see, throughout the entire book of John, this phrase, "his hour," keeps reappearing. It shows up in John chapter 2 when Jesus is at this wedding feast with his mom. They run out of something to drink, and Mary comes to Jesus and says, "What are we going to do?" And Jesus' response is, "My hour hasn't come yet." In John chapter 7, Jesus is surrounded by some people, some temple officials who wanted to arrest Jesus. But again, John says his hour had not come. And in John chapter 8, when Jesus is standing in the treasury of the temple speaking boldly, John once again says his hour had not yet come. But when you come to chapter 13 of John, John says that Jesus, knowing his hour, had come. His hour refers to his death. And when you keep reading the Gospel of John, you realize that Jesus' time to die and be glorified was extremely close. In fact, in John chapter 13 through 17, Jesus is going to have this conversation with his disciples. He's going to stop and pray with them in chapter 17. And by chapter 18, Judas is going to show up with the soldiers to arrest Jesus. Even though Jesus had all of this on his plate, he still washed the disciples' feet. Now, if you and I want to serve like Jesus served, we have to serve no matter how busy we are. You know what it's like to be busy. You're college students. Sometimes you wonder how you're going to fit everything into a 24-hour day. There's the school stuff. There's homework, tests, papers, random extra credit listening to some guy give a sermon, and then you have all your social life to worry about. Dating, social clubs, parents. And in the middle of all that, you hear these constant calls for service. There's the Lighthouse Ministry, Wishing Well, outreach programs, reading to school kids. And it's easy to stop and say, I'm too busy to serve. But if you want to serve like Jesus, you will serve even though you have a full plate. Well, some people may say, I'm too important to serve right now. Well, John didn't buy that either. The second message you find in John chapter 13 is that we should serve regardless of our personal status. Again, look at what John says in chapter 13. Jesus, knowing that he had come from the Father, and that the Father had given all things into his hands, was going back to God. And still, he stops to wash the disciples' feet. You see, the Gospel of John spends a lot of time telling you who Jesus is. The very first verse of the entire book says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And now, John says God is washing their feet. Throughout the Gospel of John, John also gives you these I am statements of Jesus. It's John who has Jesus saying, I am the vine, the door, the shepherd, the bread of life, the way, the truth, and the life. And it's also John that has Jesus constantly reminding people that he is from God, he's here to do the work of God, and he's going back to God. There was not anyone more credentialed with more high status than Jesus. But even though Jesus knew all of this about himself, John says that Jesus stood up, wrapped himself in a towel, and began to wash his disciples' feet. If we're going to serve like Jesus served, we have to serve regardless of our status. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking I'm too important, too educated, and too accomplished to be seen doing something like that. Someone needs to pick up trash, and we respond, I'm not the janitor. Someone needs to work downtown and work in a soup line, and we think, but I'm from a middle-class family. Let somebody else do it. But if you and I are going to serve like Jesus, then we have to serve no matter what our status may be. Whether we have a PhD or a GED, we are all called to serve. Well, some people may react to the invitation to serve by saying, the people may not appreciate it. And again, John won't let you buy that. The third and final lesson you find in John chapter 13 is that Jesus served regardless of the response. You see, it's clear from the text that all 12 disciples are at the meal, and John indicates in verse 12 that Jesus washed all of their feet. He washed the feet of his disciples who would all desert him. He washed the feet of Peter, who would deny him in the courtyard. And he even washed the feet of Judas, who would sell him for 30 pieces of silver. The remarkable thing about John 13 is that Jesus knew all of this would happen when he washed their feet. John says in chapter 13 and verse 11, for he knew who was to betray him. It's easy to find an excuse not to serve someone who has already hurt us in the past or someone we suspect might hurt us in the future. But Jesus' example says we should serve those who refuse to be thankful. We should serve those who refuse to return service. We should serve those who might even take advantage of us. And we should serve those who may even try to hurt us. If we want to serve like Jesus served, then we will serve regardless of the response. So when was the last time you were asked to take part in a service project on campus, at church, or in the community? It seems like everything always comes at once. Every day you and I are surrounded with opportunities and invitations to serve someone, somewhere, somehow. They come in emails and phone calls, a chapel speech, or a tap on the shoulder. And it's impossible to answer every call to serve, and if we're honest, there are some services we prefer not to provide. We have a list of our excuses, reasons why we can't serve. Some we're willing to express openly, some we're afraid to admit. Serving takes time. Serving is sometimes beneath me, and it often goes unappreciated and even abused at times. But as we've seen from John chapter 13, none of these excuses worked with Jesus. If we're going to serve like Jesus, none of those excuses work. Jesus served even though he was busy, even though he was important, and even though he would be hurt. And you and I are called to serve in the exact same way.